Hey guys, tonight we begin with a bed that is colder than the room you just left. You have spent the evening near a wood stove, perhaps in a farmhouse kitchen, where the iron door glows faintly around its edges and the air feels almost generous. Your hands are warm. Your face is warm. A kettle has been breathing steam into the room. Someone has pushed another split log into the fire, and for a little while, the whole house seems to have made peace with winter. Then you stand up. You leave the kitchen, carry a small lamp toward the stairs, and discover that warmth has borders. The first few steps are merely cooler. Halfway up, the air changes. At the top, the hallway feels still and thin. The bedroom door opens, and the room beyond it has been waiting in the cold all evening. The bed looks soft beneath its quilts, but when your hand slips under the covers, the sheets feel almost damp with chill, even when they are dry. This is the first modern illusion to lose tonight. A fire downstairs did not necessarily make an American farmhouse warm. It made one part of the farmhouse warm, sometimes two, if the house was small. The stove was strong, and the wind had decided to take the evening off. Central heating existed mainly in the sense that everyone knew where the stove was, and that creates the question for tonight. When the bedroom stayed cold, when the fire weakened after midnight, and when there was no electric blanket waiting to rescue the situation, how did farm families remain warm enough to sleep? The answer was not one clever trick. It was a small system built around the bed: fabric, fuel, body heat, room placement, bedtime habits, family arrangements, and the labour of the person who prepared all of it before anyone lay down. If quiet history about freezing bedrooms, suspiciously heavy quilts, and the heroic importance of a good wood pile sounds like your kind of bedtime company, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me how many blankets are on your bed tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine a farm somewhere in the American Midwest during the closing decades of the 19th century. We will keep the family general for now, because one farmhouse cannot stand for every region, income, or household. Winters in Maine were not the same as winters in Missouri. A prosperous owner lived differently from a tenant family in a poorly sealed dwelling. A household with nearby woodland had different fuel choices from one that had to buy coal or ration wood. But the evening problem was widely recognizable. Outside, darkness arrives early. Snow may be gathered along the fence line, or the ground may simply be hard with frost. The day's work has followed everyone indoors in the form of damp hems, muddy boots, aching shoulders, and the smell of animals clinging to wool. The kitchen or main room is the center of warmth because that is where the stove stands. It cooks the meal, heats water, dries clothing, and gives the family one place where winter can be held at a manageable distance. The bedroom is another country. In some small houses, heat rises through the stairwell or through a vent cut into the floor above the stove. This helps, but it does not perform miracles. Warm air reaching an upstairs room is still negotiating with thin walls, loose window frames, cold roofing, and drafts that appear to have studied the house more carefully than the people who built it. So bedtime begins before anyone climbs the stairs. Someone checks the stove. Someone brings in enough wood for the remaining evening and for the morning. Damp mittens are placed where they might dry without scorching. Nightclothes may be changed into near the heat rather than in the bedroom. Children delay leaving the kitchen because they understand perfectly well what waits above them. The beds themselves are prepared as carefully as the household can manage. A mattress might be filled with feathers, straw, corn husks, or another available material, depending on time, place, and means. Beneath and above it are layers with different jobs. Sheets make the bed usable. Wool blankets and quilts slow the escape of warmth. A feather bed, where a family owns one, can surround the body in a deep insulating layer. None of these things creates heat by itself. The bed is not a stove. It is more like a small fort designed to trap warmth already produced by human bodies. which means the first few minutes can be miserable. You lift the covers and slide into air that has been sealed away from the room but not yet warmed. The mattress presses back, cold and slightly resistant. Your feet search for a warmer place and find none. Pulling the covers tighter does not immediately help. The body must heat the space, little by little, while the bedding prevents that heat from escaping too quickly. This is where sharing a bed becomes more complicated than the modern image of cozy family closeness. Children often shared sleeping spaces because houses were crowded, beds were valuable, and separate rooms were not always available. Shared bodies also produced warmth more efficiently than one body alone, but shared sleep could mean elbows, cold feet, snoring, quarrels over blankets, and the discovery that your brother has somehow occupied the entire mattress while technically remaining on only half of it. A trundle bed might be pulled from beneath a larger bed. Younger children could sleep near parents. In other homes, siblings shared a bed upstairs while adults slept elsewhere. These arrangements varied by age, gender, household custom, space, and money. They could offer affection and protection. They could also reveal how little privacy ordinary domestic life allowed. For now, our imagined family settles in. A child climbs into the warmer side of the bed because another child has already been there for several minutes. One adult tucks the quilt along the edge to block a draft. Clothing for morning is placed close enough to reach without crossing the room. A small lamp is extinguished, partly to save fuel, and partly because its weak glow has completed its work. The room becomes dark. Below, the stove continues to burn. Its heat rises through the house in a fading current. For a while, the bedroom slowly improves. The quilts feel less hostile. Feet stop aching with cold. Breathing becomes regular. The body has created a pocket of warmth no larger than the space beneath the covers. That pocket is fragile. It depends on the quilt remaining in place. It depends on the sleeper staying reasonably still. It depends on bedding that is dry, on clothing that is not damp, and on enough fuel having been gathered before dark. It also depends on work that is easy to overlook, chopping wood, carrying it inside, shaking out bedding, mending fabric, washing linens, setting up sleeping places, and making sure the youngest or most vulnerable person is covered. The farmhouse bed may look like one object. In reality, it is the final shape taken by hours of labour. And as the family falls asleep, the stove downstairs begins its own slow change. Flame settles into embers. Iron cools by degrees. The warm room below grows quieter, and the faint current rising toward the bedroom becomes weaker. No one needs to wake yet, but the heat has begun to retreat. The retreat is slow enough that no one notices it at first. Downstairs, the stove still holds a red core. Upstairs, the bedroom still carries a little of the warmth that drifted up after supper. But a farmhouse does not lose heat evenly. It loses it through corners, window frames, roof boards, floor gaps, doors, and every small place where wood has shrunk or settled. The house cools according to its own private map. That map is the first thing you would need to learn. Stand in the kitchen and you may be comfortable. Move 3 steps toward an outside wall and the air changes. Sit close to the stove and your face becomes hot while your back remains cold. Open the door to a hall and the heat spills into a darker space that seems to swallow it without gratitude. Climb the stairs and each step takes you farther from the iron source below. Heat had a geography, and every family knew it. The stove was usually the strongest landmark. In many farmhouses, it occupied the kitchen or a main living room, because one fire could then perform several jobs. It cooked food, heated water, dried wet clothing, warmed hands after chores, and made the room usable during the shortest days of the year. Families gathered around it because the rest of the house could be much less inviting. Furniture often revealed the arrangement. Chairs were drawn toward the stove. Boots stood nearby. A box of wood waited within reach. A chair back might carry damp socks and mittens. The warmest room became dining room, workroom, nursery, repair shop, and evening parlour, all while trying very hard not to catch fire. Bedrooms were different. An upstairs room could receive some warmth through the staircase, through gaps in the floorboards, or through a metal grate placed over the stove room below. In preserved farmhouses, these vents sometimes appear almost comically hopeful. A small opening in the floor asked to solve an argument between winter and architecture. The vent could help. Warm air rises, and even a modest current mattered. But the result depended on the size of the house, the strength of the fire, the height of the ceiling, the condition of the walls, and the behaviour of the wind. A room directly above the stove might become tolerable. A room down the hall might remain sharply cold. One side of a bed could be warmer than the other. That difference could influence where people slept. A young child, an elderly relative, or someone who was ill might be placed closer to the main source of heat, depending on the household and the space available. In some homes, winter changed the normal use of rooms. A downstairs parlour could become a temporary sleeping place. Beds might be moved, trundles pulled nearer, or family members crowded into fewer rooms because heating a smaller occupied area required less fuel than pretending the entire house was equally habitable. Not every household had the resources to rearrange so easily. A tenant family lived within someone else's building. A hired hand might sleep where space was assigned rather than where warmth was best. A large family could know exactly which room was warmer and still lack enough beds to act on that knowledge. The floor plan became a social plan. The person nearest the stove received more than comfort. That person received easier mornings, warmer clothing, less time spent shivering before sleep, and perhaps fewer interruptions caused by cold. The person farthest away might compensate with extra bedding, another sleeper, or simple endurance. Even inside one room, temperature was uneven. Cold collected near windows and exterior walls. Drafts moved under doors. The centre of the room could feel different from the edge. A bed pushed against an outside wall saved space, but placed the sleeper close to the coldest surface. A bed near the chimney might benefit from retained warmth, though chimney placement varied. Heavy curtains, shutters, rugs, paper, cloth, or other measures could reduce some drafts, but no single layer turned a lightly built room into a modern, insulated bedroom. The window made winter visible. On a severe night, glass cooled rapidly. Moisture from breath and household activity could condense there, and in the coldest conditions, frost might form on the inside. That detail appears often in later memories because it is difficult to forget waking beside a window decorated by weather that has somehow entered the room without opening it. Children could trace shapes into the frost. Adults were more likely to see a problem involving cold air, dampness, and another surface that would eventually need attention. The roof mattered too. Snow above could provide a little insulation, but wind found weaknesses. A calm, cold night and a windy cold night were not the same event. Wind pressed against the walls and pulled warmth through cracks. It made doors tremble, set loose boards complaining, and turned tiny gaps into steady streams of moving air. A family did not need a thermometer to understand this. They learned by body memory. They knew where the floor hurt bare feet first. They knew which corner held dampness. They knew which bedroom door should remain open to admit rising warmth, and which door needed to close because it allowed too much heat to escape from the main room. They knew whether the ceiling vent worked better before the stove burned low, and whether a blanket at the bottom of a door was worth stepping over in the dark. The house became a collection of negotiations. Leave a door open, and warmth might reach another room, but the kitchen cooled faster. Close the door, and the stove room remained comfortable while the bedroom beyond it became colder. Burn more wood, and the night improved, but the pile outside shrank. Keep the fire strong, and someone had to wake, tend it, or accept the risks of an overheated stove, stray sparks, or a chimney in poor condition. There was no perfect setting. Modern heating lets us imagine temperature as a number selected on a wall. In a pre-electric farmhouse, temperature was an activity. It was changed by carrying, opening, closing, feeding, banking, hanging, moving, sharing, and waiting. Even the staircase participated. During the evening, warm air could rise through it. Later, as the stove weakened, cooler air descended while the remaining warm air gathered near the ceiling. The person sleeping low in a trundle could experience the room differently from the person sleeping higher on a thick mattress. This is one reason the old phrase, "the house was heated by a stove," tells us less than it seems to. Which room? How large was it? What fuel was burned? How often was it fed? Who slept above it? Who slept behind a closed door? Who had enough quilts to make the cold room usable? And who was expected to leave that room first in the morning? Our imagined family is still asleep, but the heat map is changing around them. The kitchen stove has settled lower. The hallway has cooled. The current through the floor vent is weaker now, little more than a reminder that warmth exists somewhere below. Near the window, the air feels sharper. Beneath the quilts, however, several bodies have slowly created a separate climate. The room and the bed are no longer experiencing the same winter. Outside the covers, the farmhouse belongs to the stove, the walls, the wind, and the remaining fuel. Under the covers, it belongs to wool, feathers, cloth, and trapped human heat. And the longer the fire fades, the more important those layers become. The first layer is not the quilt. It is the air already trapped beneath it. That small fact matters because a bed cannot warm itself. It can only slow the movement of heat away from the body. The mattress, sheets, blankets, quilts, night clothes, and any second sleeper work together to hold a pocket of air that gradually becomes warmer than the room around it. The process begins the moment someone lies down. At first, the body meets cold fabric. Heat moves outward into the sheet, then into the mattress beneath and the layers above. If the bedding is dry and thick enough, that warmth begins to accumulate. If it is damp, thin, or constantly disturbed, the body must keep replacing what escapes. This is why the bed's construction mattered. A farmhouse bed in the late 19th century might rest on wooden slats, ropes, metal springs, depending on age, money, and availability. Above that support sat the mattress, though mattress covered a wide range of experiences. A prosperous household might own a feather bed, sometimes placed over a firmer mattress. Feathers created a deep layer that held air well, but they required care. They compressed, shifted, absorbed moisture, and had to be shaken, aired, and redistributed. A feather bed that sounds luxuriously soft in a museum description could become lumpy enough to turn sleep into a negotiation with several invisible hills. Other families used ticks filled with straw, corn husks, cotton, wool, or whatever material was practical. These fillings also needed attention. Straw broke down, husks shifted, fabric covers wore thin. The contents could be replaced or refreshed, but that meant more labour and access to clean, dry material. A poorer bed might demand more repair, precisely because each part was used beyond comfort. A torn tick leaked filling. A sagging rope bed pulled bodies toward the middle. A thin mattress allowed cold from the structure beneath to reach the sleeper more quickly. Then came the sheets. Sheets did not provide the deepest insulation, but they created a cleanable surface between the body and heavier bedding. In winter, the first touch of linen or cotton could feel severe. A cold sheet seems almost personally offended by the idea that anyone expects to sleep on it. Once warmed, however, it became part of the sealed space. Above it, wool blankets offered valuable insulation because wool fibres trap air and remain useful in cool, damp conditions. Availability varied. Good wool bedding represented material value, and households cared for it accordingly. Blankets could be layered, folded, passed down, patched, or reserved for the people judged to need them most. Quilts added another form of insulation. A quilt joined a top layer, batting or filling, and backing into one large covering. Its warmth depended on materials, thickness, condition, and how many layers were used. Some were made from purchased cloth. Others preserved usable pieces from worn garments, sacks, dresses, shirts, or household fabric. Their patterns could carry family memory, but before becoming memory, the quilt had to perform a practical job. It had to stay on the bed. This could be difficult when several children shared the same covers. One sleeper rolled, another pulled, a cold shoulder appeared, a foot found an opening near the edge. The carefully constructed warm space developed a leak, and negotiations began without anyone fully waking. The heavier the bedding, the less easily it moved, which could be helpful. It could also make turning over feel like repositioning a small roof. Several quilts might be used during severe weather, especially where bedrooms receive little direct heat. The exact number varied, and memories often emphasized the weight because that sensation remained vivid long after the cold room disappeared. Layers pressed the sleeper into the mattress, holding warmth down but making movements slower. That weight could feel secure. It could also reveal who had enough bedding and who did not. A household might own quilts of different thicknesses and conditions. The newest or warmest could go to parents, infants, an elderly relative, a sick family member, or the bed nearest the greatest draught. A hired worker or older child might receive whatever remained. Affection shaped these decisions, but so did authority, usefulness, age, gender, and status. Warmth was never only a property of cloth. It was something distributed. Nightclothes added another boundary. Long shirts, drawers, stockings, socks, or other layered garments might remain on the body depending on custom and weather. People did not all sleep fully dressed, and the practice should not be treated as universal. Yet in a room cold enough to punish exposed skin, removing every useful layer made little sense. A nightcap, where worn, helped cover the head, though later images have made it seem more universal than the evidence allows. The practical point was simple. The more skin left exposed, the more quickly the sleeper noticed the temperature beyond the blankets. Hands presented their own problem. Tuck them beneath the covers, and they warmed. Leave one outside after settling a child or adjusting the lamp, and it cooled quickly. Bringing it back under the quilt created a brief disturbance nobody appreciated. Feet were worse. They entered the bed cold from the floor, the staircase, or the process of undressing. Thick socks could help. So could another body already occupying the warmest portion of the mattress. Younger siblings probably did not describe this as an efficient transfer of thermal energy. They described it as someone putting freezing feet against them without permission. The bed's position also changed how well these layers worked. Against an outside wall, the sleeper felt the cold surface nearby. Beneath a window, drafts found the head and shoulders. Near a chimney or above a heated room, the same bedding performed better because it was not defending against such a severe temperature difference. Bed curtains, where used, created another barrier around the sleeping space. Heavy fabric reduced air movement and preserved a slightly warmer pocket, though it required material, maintenance, and a frame suited to hanging it. These were not standard equipment in every farmhouse. Their presence says something about period, region, wealth, or inherited furniture. Even without formal curtains, families improvised. A blanket might be hung where a draft was strongest. A bed could be shifted away from a window. Two sleeping spaces might be combined during the coldest weather. A trundle could be positioned near the warmer side of the room. None of these choices made winter disappear. They reduced the places through which body heat could escape. Moisture remained the quiet enemy. Bedding absorbed perspiration and household dampness. If it was never aired, it became less pleasant and potentially less effective. On clear days, blankets and mattresses could be turned, shaken, or exposed to fresh air and sunlight. This work rarely appears in the romantic picture of a quilt folded neatly across a historic bed. The picture does not show lifting, carrying, repairing seams, replacing, filling, washing what could be washed, and finding enough dry weather to finish the task. A bed was maintained the way a stove was maintained. Both required fuel, though the bed's fuel was cloth, filling, sewing, washing, and human heat. Our sleeping family now lies beneath those accumulated layers. The room has grown colder, but the space under the quilts has stabilized. A child near the wall turns inward. Another knee finds the warm center. The mattress has softened beneath the combined weight. The blankets no longer feel cold. For the moment, the system is working. Yet the bed's warmth depends on remaining closed. Soon, someone will lift an edge, move across the room, or bring in an object warmed beside the stove. And for a few seconds, the winter outside the covers will rush in. The rush lasts only a moment, but everyone feels it. A quilt edge lifts. Cold air slides beneath the layers. One sleeper complains without opening their eyes. Another curls tighter. Then a hand appears, carrying something wrapped in cloth. In some households, surviving recollections describe warmed bricks, heated stones, hot water containers, or older metal bed warmers being used to take the sharpest chill from the sheets. These practices varied sharply by region, decade, household means, and what objects happened to remain in use. The logic was simple. The bed was cold because the room was cold. So before the body entered, the household tried to place a little heat inside it. A brick could be warmed near the stove, wrapped carefully, and set beneath the covers near the feet. Stone served a similar purpose where the right material was available. A hot water container could provide gentler warmth, though it might leak, crack, or cool quickly. Older warming pans, inherited or still in use in some homes, could carry hot coals between the sheets before bedtime. That last method looked efficient. It also asked someone to carry live heat through a house full of dry wood and fabric, solving one problem while introducing several enthusiastic new ones. A warming pan had to keep moving. Leave it too long, and the bedding could scorch. Poorly contained coals introduced sparks or fumes. The goal was warm sheets, not a second fireplace beneath the quilt. Even a simple brick required judgment. Too cool, and it accomplished little. Too hot, and it could burn through thin wrapping. A hot water container had to be sealed and placed where a restless foot would not knock it loose. The object was usually wrapped in cloth or an old piece of blanket. This slowed the release of heat and protected the sleeper from direct contact. It also turned a hard brick into something slightly less surprising to encounter with your toes in the dark. The object was most useful at the foot of the bed. Feet entered colder than the rest of the body after crossing the floor and standing through undressing. Once they warmed, the whole bed felt more tolerable. But the object did not warm the whole room. It created another small island, smaller even than the bed itself. For a child, that island might be shared. 2 pairs of feet searched for the same wrapped brick. Someone claimed it had been placed on their side. Someone else argued that heat did not belong to one person. The brick, having no interest in household justice, cooled in the middle. Preparing these objects belonged to the larger bedtime routine. Water had to be heated, bricks or stones had to warm without cracking, cloth had to be found, the bed opened, the object placed, and the covers closed again. This work happened while other evening tasks continued. Dishes were washed, lamps were trimmed, children were sent to bed, clothing was checked for dampness. Tomorrow's fuel was brought closer. A baby needed settling. An older child had remembered, with impressive timing, something essential in another room. The warmed bed was therefore not a single action. It was one more item inside a chain of household work. Clothing could be prepared in much the same way. A shirt, stockings, or other garments might be placed near the stove before bedtime, or arranged where morning warmth could reach them. This required caution. Fabric left too close to an open flame or hot stove surface could scorch or ignite. The safest position was warm enough to help, far enough away to avoid turning breakfast into a fire drill. The practice mattered because morning clothing could feel almost as hostile as cold sheets. A garment left in an unheated room took on that room's temperature. Pulling it over warm skin was an abrupt introduction to the day. Clothes near the bed were reachable. Clothes near the stove were warmer but farther away. Every arrangement involved a trade. Stay near the bed, and the clothes remained cold. Leave them near the fire, and someone had to go get them. Where one person rose first, that person could place clothing near the returning heat. A mother preparing breakfast, an older child tending the stove, or a man heading to livestock might warm the room for everyone else. The first person awake became part of everyone else's bedding system. Before that morning arrives, however, the family still has several hours to pass. The brick begins to cool. The bottle loses heat. The stone becomes merely less cold than the mattress. Its job was never to replace the fire, only to carry the bed through the opening minutes before body heat accumulated. That time he explains why these methods could feel effective. The worst part is often the beginning. Once the sheets warm and the quilts trap enough heat, the object becomes less important. The body now does most of the work. The household has shifted heat through several forms. Wood became flame. Flame warmed iron. Iron warmed water. Brick, stone, or metal. That object warmed cloth. The cloth reduced the body's first loss of heat. What looks like a simple bedtime trick is really a chain of energy and labour stretching from the outdoor woodpile to the space beneath the quilt. And every link could fail. Wet wood produced poor heat. A weak fire warmed the brick slowly. Careless wrapping burned skin. A leaking bottle soaked bedding. A warming pan scorched cloth. A sleepy child could push the object onto the floor, where it waited for the first bare foot of morning. Families learned through repetition. They knew which brick held heat, how much cloth it needed, which bed came first, and which sleeper would complain regardless. That knowledge rarely appeared as formal expertise. It lived in hands. A palm tested the wrapping. Fingers checked a stopper. Someone lifted a quilt and judged whether the sheets had lost their sharpest cold. The object was moved a few inches, then covered again. A wealthier household might own a manufactured warmer. A poorer one adapted what was available. Better containers, more bedding, and reliable fuel reduced risk. Scarcity demanded improvisation. Our family's wrapped brick now lies near the foot of the bed. For several minutes, it has done its work. The children have stopped searching for it. The quilt has settled. One small patch of mattress remains warmer than the rest, and the air beneath the covers no longer changes each time someone moves. Across the room, clothing waits in a careful pile. Downstairs, the fire gives another soft collapse as a piece of wood settles into embers. The bed is warm enough now, but it has become warm through objects, fuel, cloth, and hands that prepared it before anyone slept. And those same hands will soon have to decide how much warmth can be shared, who sleeps beside whom, and where each body belongs when the house does not have enough comfortable space for everyone. The answer is rarely written on the wall. It is decided by habit, age, authority, space, and the simple fact that a household may own fewer beds than it has sleepers. In a small farmhouse, sleeping arrangements could change with the season. A child who slept alone during warmer weather might share with a sibling once the cold deepened. A trundle could be pulled from beneath a larger bed. A cradle might be moved closer to the stove room. An older relative could be given the place least exposed to drafts. The house did not need a formal chart. Everyone usually knew where they belonged. That knowledge began with the bed itself. A bed was expensive, bulky, and useful for decades. The frame, ropes, slats, mattress, sheets, blankets, and quilts represented money or labour that could not always be multiplied simply because the family had grown. Children arrived more quickly than furniture did, which is one of history's quieter logistical problems. So people shared. 2 siblings beneath one quilt could conserve warmth, but the arrangement also conserved space and bedding. 3 children in one room required less heating than 3 children in separate rooms. In households with only 1 or 2 heated spaces, this mattered. One body warmed the mattress. A second body warmed the air under the covers faster. A child climbing into an occupied bed found that the sharpest cold had been reduced. Parents could keep younger children within reach. In a house where the temperature fell through the night, closeness served several purposes at once. Closeness also had elbows. A shared bed required rules, though few needed to be spoken aloud. Stay on your side. Do not pull the quilt. Keep your knees to yourself. Do not introduce frozen feet without warning. These rules were simple, reasonable, and ignored with impressive consistency. A trundle bed offered one solution. It was a low bed stored beneath a larger one and pulled out at night. In Herbert Hoover's Iowa birthplace, the two young Hoover boys shared a trundle beneath their parents' bed, while their baby sister slept nearby in a cradle. That preserved space and kept small children close to adults in a compact home. The arrangement could feel secure. A child waking in darkness heard parents breathing a few feet away. The family occupied one shared zone of warmth. The larger bed above, the trundle below, and the cradle nearby turned a single room into a complete nighttime household. But the image should not be made too sweet. A trundle sat low, closer to the cold floor. Dust gathered there. The sleeper had little privacy and understood that the room belonged primarily to the adults above. Warmth and hierarchy occupied the same floorboards. Other households arranged siblings by age and gender. Young children might sleep together freely. As they grew older, expectations about modesty could change. Boys and girls might be separated when enough space existed, though poverty or crowding often made ideal arrangements impossible. Family customs, religious expectations, house design, and local standards all influenced what counted as proper. The word privacy meant something different when several people shared a room. Changing clothes, settling infants, whispering, snoring, coughing, and waking happened within earshot of others. Curtains, screens, furniture placement, or simply looking away created modest boundaries where walls could not. A separate bedroom was not always the first measure of comfort. A warmer shared room could be preferable to a private freezing one. The choice was not always offered. Children slept where parents placed them. Hired workers slept where employers had room. A widowed relative, visiting cousin, seasonal hand, or boarder might alter the arrangement again. A household could rearrange itself around harvest labour, illness, birth, marriage, or severe weather. The bed became flexible social architecture. One season it held two brothers. Another, an elderly grandmother occupied it because the stairs had become difficult. A sick child could be moved nearer the parents. A new baby could displace an older child to a trundle or another room. No wall moved, yet the household map changed. Who received the best position revealed priorities. A bed nearest the stove or chimney offered an advantage. A place away from the window reduced drafts. The inner side of a shared bed could be warmer than the edge. The person who entered first helped warm the bedding, while the person arriving later benefited from that work. A domestic arrangement children may have interpreted as theft. Infants demanded special attention. A cradle or small bed could be placed near adults, but warmth had to be balanced with safety. Too much bedding around a baby created risks that families did not always understand in modern terms. Too little left the child vulnerable to cold. Parents relied on touch, observation, habit, and whatever advice circulated in the household. The adult responsible for night care did not experience the bed as an uninterrupted refuge. A baby stirred. A child coughed. Someone needed water. The quilt lifted. Warm air escaped. Feet returned to the floor. By the time the child was settled, one side of the adult bed had cooled again. The person doing this labour was often a woman, though households varied. Mothers, older daughters, grandmothers, sisters, and female relatives carried much of the work of nighttime care. Bedding preparation, sewing, washing, and settling children. Their effort appears indirectly in surviving objects. A quilt remains. The hours spent repairing it do not. The same invisibility surrounds hired hands and domestic workers. A farm worker might sleep in an attic, side room, bunk space, or outbuilding. The sleeping place expressed the worker's position. He might share with another hand, receive older bedding, or live farther from household heat. Warmth followed status as well as architecture. A prosperous family could own more beds and still assign different levels of comfort. A poor family might share because no alternative existed. A tenant household could improve bedding but not move a badly placed wall or repair every draft in a house it did not own. Black farm families in the rural South, especially tenants and sharecroppers, often faced limits shaped by debt, discrimination, poor housing, and restricted access to property. Their winter sleeping arrangements cannot be treated as a colourful variation on generic farm life. The colder room could be connected to who owned the building, controlled credit, and decided whose comfort deserved investment. The same caution applies to immigrant households and marginal farms elsewhere. Crowding was not evidence that people lacked dignity or standards. It often showed how families adapted to money, housing, labour, and weather that gave them little room to choose. Inside our imagined bedroom, 2 children have now settled into the trundle. One lies near the wall, the other has claimed the warmer centre. Their feet have stopped searching for the wrapped brick, which is cooling beneath the covers. Above them, the larger bed creaks as an adult turns toward the cradle. For a few minutes, the room is still. The arrangement looks simple. Parents above, children below, infant nearby. But every position carries meaning. The adults hold authority and nighttime responsibility. The infant receives attention because vulnerability demands it. The boys share space because children adapt around the household's limits. The trundle saves room but keeps them close to the cold floor. The quilts provide warmth, but only because someone made, repaired, lifted, and tucked them. Shared sleep is therefore neither purely cosy nor purely miserable. It is warmth, necessity, surveillance, affection, inconvenience, labour, and hierarchy, folded together beneath one cover. And while the family occupies this carefully arranged island, the stove downstairs continues to lose strength. Soon the question will no longer be who shares the bed. It will be whether the fire can be trusted to last until morning. The fire cannot be trusted. It can be managed, encouraged, fed, watched, and prepared. But once the household is asleep, a stove becomes less like a servant and more like an arrangement with consequences. Before bed, someone opens the iron door and looks inside. The bright flames from supper have settled. A few pieces of wood remain, glowing along their edges. The person tending the stove may add a larger log, adjust the draft, rake embers together, or bank the fire so that heat lasts longer without burning too quickly. Banking a fire meant slowing it down. Depending on the stove, the fuel, and the household's habits, embers could be gathered and partly covered with ash. Airflow might be reduced. A dense piece of wood or coal could be placed where it would burn gradually. The goal was not a roaring fire. A roaring fire was warm, impressive, and very efficient at turning tomorrow's fuel into tonight's chimney smoke. The goal was a controlled red core that might survive until morning. This required judgment because every stove behaved differently. A cast iron cookstove with damp wood did not respond like a parlour stove burning good coal. A chimney that drew well on a calm evening could behave differently in strong wind. A newly cleaned flue and a neglected one were not the same machine, even if the stove door looked identical. The person tending the fire learned its sounds. A steady draft made one kind of low pull. A log settling made another. Iron expanded and contracted with small clicks. Smoke entering the room meant something was wrong, though the reason might be poor draft, damp fuel, a blocked flue, wind pressure, or the unfortunate decision to open the stove door too quickly. The stove communicated mostly through heat, smell, and inconvenience. If the draft was left too open, the fuel burned rapidly, the room became hot for a while, then cold before dawn. If the air supply was reduced too far, the fire might smoulder poorly, produce more smoke, or die. If too much fuel was packed inside, the stove could overheat. A household trying to save one trip downstairs could accidentally create a much larger reason to leave the bed. So the final evening check was careful. A hand brought in one more armload of wood. Snow or frost melted from the bark onto the floor. Ash was moved aside. The strongest embers were gathered. A larger split was placed across them. The door closed. The draft was adjusted. Then someone waited. Not for long, perhaps, but long enough to make sure the new wood caught properly and the stove was behaving. A person could not simply load it, walk away, and assume that iron, flame, dry timber, and an aging chimney had agreed to cooperate. This waiting was part of bedtime. Elsewhere in the room, the lamp burned lower. Children had already gone upstairs. A kettle was moved. Boots were set where they might dry. The person beside the stove watched one corner of the new log begin to glow and decided whether that was enough. Only then could the house become quiet. Coal changed the details where it was available and affordable. It could burn longer and more steadily than many kinds of wood, but it required purchase, transport, storage, and a stove designed or adapted for it. Coal dust entered the house. Ash had to be removed. Draft control still mattered. A coal fire could last through the night more reliably under good conditions, yet it did not remove the need for work or caution. Wood carried its own calendar. The best winter fuel had been cut, split, stacked, and dried before it was needed. Green wood contained too much moisture and burned poorly. It smoked, hissed, and used part of its heat merely to drive water from itself. A family short of seasoned wood might still burn it, because winter does not postpone itself while fuel improves. Different woods behave differently. Dense hardwoods often produced longer-lasting coals. Softer woods could catch quickly but burn faster. Households learned what their land provided, what could be purchased, and what should be saved for the coldest nights. That knowledge sat quietly behind the stove door. The log added before bed was not chosen at random. Someone might select a heavier piece because it would last. Smaller splits helped establish the burn. Scraps that flared quickly were useful for starting a fire, less useful for carrying it through several hours of darkness. Fuel was therefore measured in time. One armload might mean a warm supper, another meant dry clothing. A dense log meant a chance of finding live embers before dawn. The shrinking stack beside the house was a clock counting towards spring. Inside, the fire now appears stable. The room near the stove is still warm, perhaps too warm for anyone wearing thick clothing. Upstairs, that warmth arrives only as a faint current. Beneath the quilts, the family does not need much from the stove anymore. Their bodies have heated the bedding. The fire's task is smaller now. Keep the house from cooling too quickly, protect water and objects near the heated room from the worst cold, and leave enough life for morning. But keeping a fire alive all night was not always worth the fuel or risk. Some families allowed it to die. Others tried to preserve embers. Some maintained stronger overnight heat during severe weather, illness, childbirth, or when infants and elderly relatives needed protection. Practices changed according to the stove, the house, the weather, the fuel supply, and who was available to tend it. There was no universal rural bedtime setting marked winter. Fire also brought danger into the centre of the home. Sparks could escape from an open fireplace. Stovepipes could become dangerously hot. Creosote or soot in a chimney increased fire risk. Ashes that appeared dead could still hide embers. Clothing, wood, paper, or bedding placed too close to heat could ignite. A poorly vented or malfunctioning stove could fill a room with smoke and harmful gases that people did not always understand with modern precision. The object keeping the family alive through winter could also threaten the house. That contradiction was ordinary rather than dramatic. Families lived with fire because they needed it. Safety meant repeated habits, clearing ash, watching sparks, maintaining chimneys, keeping combustible material back, checking doors and drafts, and teaching children that the stove was useful, hot, and not interested in forgiveness. The children upstairs may sleep through all of this. They know the stove as a source of warmth, breakfast, and the place where cold socks become wearable again. They may not think about the chimney above the roof or the pile of ash waiting to be carried out. They probably do not calculate how much fuel remains. Someone else does. That person lies down later. By the time the final adult reaches the bedroom, the sheets have already begun to warm around the other sleepers. The room is colder than before. Clothing is placed within reach. The quilt is lifted with care, and one last movement of cold air passes through the bed. Below, the banked fire holds. For the first hour, perhaps two, the red core remains strong. Then the new log settles. Ash forms around it. The stove's surface cools slightly. The heat climbing the stairwell weakens until the upstairs room receives almost nothing. The family continues sleeping because the bed has become its own climate. The stove has not failed, It is doing exactly what a limited fire does. It is becoming smaller, and sometime before dawn, someone will have to discover whether enough life remains inside the ash to begin again. Enough life may remain, but only because someone carried the future fire into the house before anyone went to bed. The ember beneath the ash looks like the beginning of morning. In reality, it is the end of a much longer chain that began outdoors months earlier with a tree, an axe, a saw, a wagon, a splitting block, and the uncomfortable knowledge that winter would eventually test every optimistic estimate. The woodpile was part of the bed. It stood outside the wall, beside a shed, under an overhang, or wherever fuel could remain dry and close enough to reach during bad weather. From the bedroom window, it might look like an ordinary stack of split logs, but each piece represented work already completed. Cutting, trimming, hauling, splitting, stacking, drying, and finally carrying. A family that waited until the first hard freeze to think seriously about fuel had allowed the weather to become management. Wood was often prepared well before winter because fresh-cut timber contained moisture. Green wood could burn, but it burned reluctantly. It hissed, smoked, and spent part of its heat driving water out of itself. Seasoned wood caught more easily and delivered more useful warmth. That meant the winter fire began in another season. A tree was selected and felled, branches were removed, the trunk was cut into lengths suited to the stove, larger rounds were split, sometimes by repeated blows that looked simple only when performed by someone else. The pieces were stacked so air could circulate through them. Then they waited. The work found a rhythm. A saw moved through the grain. An axe struck the same line until the round opened. Split pieces landed with a hollow wooden knock. Bark loosened beneath gloves. Chips scattered around the block. Children might carry smaller pieces, gather kindling, or help stack wood according to age and household expectations. The work warmed the body long before the fuel warmed the house. Hands grew sore. Snow or mud complicated footing. A dull blade increased effort. Twisted grain and knots resisted a clean split. Fuel preparation demanded tools, time, access to timber, and the right to use the land. A farm with woodland could draw from its own property, though cutting still required judgment and labour. A tenant family might depend on a landlord's rules, purchased fuel, gathered deadwood, or whatever access the tenancy allowed. In sparsely wooded areas, households adapted through coal, brush, crop residues, or other available fuels. The phrase, "they heated with wood," hides all of this. Whose wood? Cut from where? With which tools? Carried by whom? And what happened when the stack began shrinking faster than the calendar? Late winter made the answer visible. In early autumn, a full woodpile looked reassuring. By February, gaps appeared. Pieces saved for severe weather became harder to ignore. A household might burn smaller fires during milder hours and reserve dense hardwood for the coldest nights. A log was no longer only a log. It became supper, dry mittens, warm wash water, or several hours of sleep. Using it for one purpose meant not using it for another. This is why the person tending the stove might hesitate before adding more fuel at midnight. The bedroom was cold, but the family was already beneath quilts. The remaining wood might be needed at dawn, when bodies had to leave those quilts and the kitchen had to become usable again. Another log would improve the bedroom for an hour. It would also be one less log waiting beside the stove at dawn. Children contributed where they could. A younger child might fill a wood box with small pieces. An older child could help saw, split, or haul. Chores varied by family and circumstance, but fuel work often entered childhood early because the stove consumed material every day and showed no interest in school schedules. The wood box inside the house had to be replenished. This smaller task looked easier than cutting, yet it repeated constantly. Someone crossed the yard, lifted an armload, brushed off snow, opened the door, and carried bark, dust, cold air, and sometimes insects into the warm room. The person nearest the door received the draft. The person carrying the load received splinters. Everyone received the fire. That pattern matters because household warmth can appear communal while the cost remains uneven. Men and older boys often performed much of the heavy felling, sawing, splitting and hauling in many farm households, though circumstances varied. Women and girls also carried fuel, managed stoves, cooked over them, cleared ash, dried clothing, and stretched each fire across several domestic tasks. Widows, injured workers, tenant households, and small farms did not always follow the tidy divisions later memory prefers. Work followed necessity more reliably than nostalgia. Even where one person cut the wood, another often managed its daily use. The cookstove was not filled once and forgotten. Dampers were adjusted. Ash accumulated. Small pieces were chosen for quick heat. Larger ones were saved for endurance. Cooking, wet clothing, illness, or a severe cold spell changed the calculation again. The person responsible for the stove became a quiet energy manager without receiving a title. There were no digital readings or automatic feeds. There was smoke, fading heat, a darkening stove surface, and the familiar sound of a room becoming colder. Ash created its own labour. It had to be removed without scattering dust or carrying hidden embers into an unsafe container. Too much ash could restrict airflow. Careless disposal could start a fire. The remains of yesterday's warmth still demanded judgment. Then there was kindling. A large log did not politely ignite because morning had arrived. Small dry material helped revive a weak ember or start again from cold. Splinters, shavings, and thin sticks needed to be kept where they could be reached. This preparation decided whether morning began with a quick flame or a long period of kneeling before a stubborn stove while cold clothing waited nearby. You would probably fail at this before breakfast, not because you lacked strength, but because no one had taught you which wood caught quickly, how to set the draft, how much ash to leave, or how to recognize an ember worth saving. Farm children absorbed it through repetition. They watched adults build fires. They learned the difference between a flame that looked impressive and a coal bed that would last. They discovered that one wet piece of wood could fill the room with smoke, and that a stove door should not be opened with excessive confidence. By adulthood, the process felt ordinary. That ordinariness is why the labour disappears so easily from the image of a sleeping farmhouse. We see the bed, the quilt, perhaps the red stove in the room below. We do not automatically see the tree cut in autumn, the wagon moving over rough ground, the stack measured against the coming months, or the child carrying one final armload after dark. Yet all of it is present beneath the covers. The quilt traps body heat. The mattress slows the cold rising from below. The shared bed reduces empty space. But without fuel, the house cools faster. Clothing stays damp. Water freezes sooner. And morning begins with fewer choices. The woodpile is therefore not outside the story of sleep. It is sleep stored in another form. Our family remains beneath the quilts while the night moves toward its coldest hours. Downstairs, a faint ember waits beneath the ash. Beside the stove, only a few pieces remain in the indoor wood box. Outside, the stack sits under frost, each log holding a portion of tomorrow. And before sunrise, one person will have to leave the warm bed, cross the cold floor, and turn that stored labour back into fire. But before anyone leaves the bed, the household has already made another decision. It has decided where warmth is allowed to gather. The decision may never be announced. No one stands in the kitchen with a list assigning degrees of comfort. It appears instead in the position of a cradle, the thickness of a quilt, the side of a mattress, the room chosen for an elderly relative, and the person expected to rise first. Warmth is distributed through ordinary arrangements. An infant may sleep near the parents because the child needs watching and cannot manage cold alone. A sick family member may be moved closer to the stove room. A grandparent who struggles with stairs may receive a downstairs bed. younger children may be placed together, while an older child sleeps farther from the heat because the household assumes that age brings endurance. Sometimes that assumption is reasonable. Sometimes it is merely convenient. A family with limited fuel cannot heat every room, and a family with limited bedding cannot give every sleeper the thickest covering. Someone chooses. The choice may be guided by care, habit, authority, usefulness, or the belief that one person can tolerate more discomfort than another. That is the point at which the story changes. Until now, the cold has looked like a contest between the farmhouse and winter. The walls leak heat, the stove consumes wood, the bed traps what warmth the body can make. But the cold does not meet a collection of equal sleepers. It meets a household. A household has ages, duties, dependencies, rank, affection, and rules. It has people who decide and people who adjust. It has one person who knows where the extra blanket is kept, and another who is not permitted to take it without asking. The warmest place is therefore never only a place. It is an allocation. Consider the bed nearest the chimney or the room above the stove. Perhaps it belongs to the parents because the parents own the household and the bed. Perhaps it is given to small children during a bitter spell. Perhaps an ill relative is brought there temporarily. The answer changes from family to family, but the location still reveals a priority. The same is true beneath the covers. In a shared bed, the warmer centre is limited. The place beside the wall is colder. The outer sleeper receives more drafts whenever the quilt lifts. Children may settle this through argument, seniority, parental instruction, or the ancient household principle that whoever falls asleep first has somehow acquired legal title to the middle. The joke is small. The consequence is physical. A child near the edge loses heat faster. The sleeper closest to an infant wakes more often. The adult beside the door is more likely to answer a noise. The person placed near the stove benefits from warmth, but may also be responsible for tending it. Comfort and duty can occupy the same position. This is especially clear when someone is ill. A feverish child may receive the best quilt, the warmest room, and more fuel through the night. Other sleepers accept colder spaces because the household has decided that vulnerability comes first. Yet care itself consumes resources. The extra log used for the sick room is no longer available for morning. The adult sitting awake cannot preserve their own bed warmth. The person heating water or changing bedding performs labour while the rest of the family sleeps. Warmth moves toward one body because work moves away from another. The same transfer happens with infants. A cradle near the bed allows quick attention, but the adult who responds repeatedly experiences the room differently from everyone else. The household may appear to be sharing one warm sleeping space. In practice, one person keeps opening it. Even the quilt has an order. The newest covering may be saved for guests, marriage, illness, or severe cold. A worn quilt may remain in daily use because it can still hold some warmth. A wool blanket might be placed where its insulation is most needed. An extra layer could go to the smallest children, or to the household head, or to the person whose work begins earliest. There is no universal rule hiding here. That absence is important. Affection did not always defeat hierarchy. Authority did not always defeat need. Families made decisions within their own values and pressures. Some protected the vulnerable first. Some preserved the comfort of the person considered most economically important. Many probably did both at different moments and explained the choice as simple common sense. Common sense often carries the shape of the household that produced it. Farm work added another layer. The person expected to milk before dawn, feed livestock, or prepare breakfast might need clothing placed close at hand and a route to the stairs that did not cross several sleepers. A hired hand could be given a bed near an exit because he rose early, though that same position might be colder. An older child might move to a less comfortable place when a new baby arrived. The sleeping map changed whenever dependency changed. Birth moved bodies. Illness moved bedding. Age moved people downstairs. A severe storm compressed the family into fewer rooms. A hired worker, visiting relative, or seasonal labourer forced another adjustment. The house did not need to become larger. It kept assigning new meanings to the same square feet. This is why a bed cannot be understood only by examining its frame. You have to ask who was allowed to use it, who shared it, who maintained it, who received the inner side, and who had the authority to change the arrangement. The same questions apply to fuel. The person cutting wood may not control how it is used. The person managing the stove may stretch it across cooking, washing, drying, and sleep. A child carrying kindling contributes to a warmth budget without deciding which room receives the result. Everyone may help create heat. Not everyone has equal power over it. That inequality can remain gentle inside a loving family. Parents make decisions for children because children depend on them. Adults protect infants and sick relatives. Siblings share because space is limited. But necessity does not erase the hierarchy. It makes the hierarchy visible through the body. Who stays warm? Who gets up? Who sleeps near the draft? Who has another quilt? Who may ask for more wood? Who must accept the answer? By the middle of the night, these decisions have become almost invisible. The family is asleep. The quilts rise and fall. The stove burns lower. No one appears to be allocating anything, yet the arrangement is still working. One child lies beside the wall. One adult sleeps nearest the cradle. One person's clothing waits closest to the door. One body will leave the bed first. The farmhouse has divided a scarce resource through rooms, fabric, duty, and trust. And that stored labour did not purchase the same night for every household. Two farm families could live within the same county, face the same wind, and own very different winters. One slept in a tight frame house with several usable rooms, a dependable stove, seasoned wood, wool blankets, and enough quilts to rotate when one needed washing. Another occupied a drafty tenant house whose walls, windows, and roof belonged to someone else. Both might be called farm families. The phrase makes them sound more alike than they were. A prosperous owner-operated farm could offer choices. The household might have more than one stove, better windows, thicker walls, a cellar, a separate parlour, or bedrooms positioned around a chimney. It might own enough bedding to assign several layers to each bed. Fuel could be drawn from woodland on the property, purchased before prices rose, or stored in quantities large enough to make a severe cold spell inconvenient rather than dangerous. Prosperity did not create modern comfort. A large farmhouse could still be difficult to heat, and more rooms meant more cold space. But money and ownership allowed a family to repair, rearrange, and prepare. A cracked window could be replaced. A stove could be upgraded. A chimney could be maintained. More blankets could be bought or made with purchased materials. The family could choose which rooms to close and which to use through winter. Ownership created the ability to change the structure itself. A tenant family often had fewer choices. If the window frame leaked air, the household might stuff cloth into the gap, hang a blanket, or place paper where it helped. If the roof admitted moisture, the tenant could move the bed or set out a container, but a permanent repair depended on money, permission, materials, and the landlord's willingness. The cold room was then more than weather. It was a property relationship made physical. A family could labour all day on land it did not own, and return at night to a dwelling it could not fully improve. Bedding, stove management, and room sharing became ways to compensate for architecture controlled by someone else. This distinction mattered sharply for sharecropping households in the rural South. Black families and poor white families worked under systems that could leave them indebted and materially dependent. But racial discrimination placed additional limits on black households through restricted land ownership, credit, legal protection, and political power. Their houses varied widely, and no single room can represent them all. Yet poorer tenant dwellings were often lightly built, poorly insulated, and maintained according to the priorities of the landowner rather than the comfort of the family living inside. The draft beneath the door could therefore carry an entire economic system with it. That does not mean the household lacked skill, pride, or care. Families repaired what they could, made quilts, reused cloth, shared work, and created orderly homes within severe limits. Resourcefulness should be respected without being used to decorate poverty. A quilt made from scraps is evidence of skill. It is not proof that scarcity was charming. The same caution applies further north and west. A mortgaged farmer in Iowa, a tenant in Missouri, an immigrant family in the Dakotas, or a marginal household in Appalachia might own different tools and follow different customs, but each could face the same basic problem. Comfort depended on resources that were not equally available. Fuel made the inequality especially clear. A farm with healthy woodland had access to a material source of heat, though someone still had to cut and carry it. A household without timber might buy coal or wood, gather what was permitted, use crop waste where practical, or burn fuel of lower quality. The amount stored before winter mattered. So did the right to gather more. A tenant could look across land covered with trees and still lack permission to cut them. A hired worker could spend the day splitting fuel for the main house and sleep in a side room, attic, bunk space, or outbuilding heated less generously. The labourer might create warmth without receiving an equal share of it. Sleeping quarters for hired hands varied. Some workers lived as part of the household and ate at the family table. Others occupied separate spaces shaped by local custom, the type of farm, the season, and the employer's means. Their bedding might be adequate, old, shared, or improvised. The important question is not whether every hired hand slept badly. It is who controlled the room, the fuel, and the decision to improve it. Household members also received unequal comfort. An infant might be kept near adults. An elderly parent could be moved downstairs. The person considered most vulnerable might receive the warmest bedding. Yet authority and status could matter as much as need. Parents assigned beds. Employers assigned rooms. Older siblings sometimes claimed the inner side of the mattress. The person who made the rules rarely described the arrangement as a system of power. It was simply where everyone slept. Material differences appeared in small objects. One bed had a thick feather layer, another had a thin tick that needed fresh filling. One household owned wool blankets in good condition, another depended on patched coverings whose worn sections allowed heat to escape. One room had shutters that closed tightly, another had a cloth hung across the window. A prosperous family might have a guest bedroom too cold for ordinary winter use, but still possess enough occupied space near the stove. A poorer family might crowd several sleepers into one room because that was the only efficient choice. Crowding and comfort did not always move in opposite directions. A small shared room could be warmer than a large private bedroom. A wealthy child alone upstairs might sleep in colder air than three siblings sharing a bed in a compact house. Yet the wealthy household had more ways to respond: better bedding, another fire, repaired windows, a different room, or paid labour to manage the fuel. The distinction was choice. A family with choices could treat cold as a problem to solve. A family without them treated it as a condition to survive. The surviving record does not distribute attention evenly either. Historic farmhouses are often preserved because someone became prominent, descendants protected the property, or an institution considered the building important. Their rooms give valuable evidence about beds, stoves, vents, furniture, and family arrangements, but they cannot automatically stand in for the poorest tenant house nearby. The poorest dwelling was less likely to be photographed carefully, described in loving detail, or preserved after the family moved away. Its window disappeared. Its stove rusted. Its occupants entered records through rent, debt, crop totals, census categories, or the judgment of an official who did not sleep there. This silence matters because it can make rural winter appear more uniform than it was. Our imagined family has so far possessed a functioning stove, several quilts, a trundle, a dry wood pile, and enough household stability to prepare before winter. None of these things should be assumed. Move the same family into a house with thinner walls, fewer blankets, damp fuel, or no control over repairs, and every part of the night changes. The bed takes longer to warm. The fire dies sooner. More bodies share fewer covers. The first person up faces a colder room and fewer dry pieces of kindling. The method remains recognizable. The margin for failure becomes smaller. Outside, the wind crosses every property line without noticing who owns the land. Inside, however, it meets different walls, different windows, different fuel reserves, and different amounts of authority. Winter may arrive equally. It does not enter every farmhouse on equal terms, nor did it enter every region in the same way. A winter night in northern New England did not feel like one in the rural south. A farmhouse on the Great Plains confronted a different kind of exposure from a wooded valley in Appalachia. Even within one state, elevation, wind, building material, access to fuel, and family income could change the entire sleeping arrangement. The title says American farm families, but America contained several winters. In the upper Midwest, cold could settle in for long stretches. Snow remained on the ground, water froze quickly, and a poorly heated bedroom could stay cold day after day rather than merely during one unusual night. Farm families who had reliable access to wood or coal might prepare large fuel stores, close unused rooms, and organize winter life around the kitchen stove. The farmhouse became smaller without physically shrinking. Rooms that were useful in summer could be abandoned until spring. Doors stayed shut. Work moved toward the heated center. Children dressed near the stove, then hurried through cold passages only when necessary. Beds upstairs depended heavily on thick coverings, shared warmth, and whatever heat rose through stairs or vents. In this climate, fuel planning had little room for optimism. A full wood pile in October was a promise that had to survive January. By late winter, the stack told the truth. If it had been measured badly, cut too late, or consumed by an especially severe season, every remaining log carried more value. On the open parts of the Midwest and Great Plains, cold air did not need to search for the farmhouse. It arrived at speed. Trees or shelter belts could reduce its force where they existed, but many homes stood exposed to weather moving across wide ground. A crack that felt minor on a calm evening became a steady current when the wind pressed against one side of the house. Beds might be moved away from outside walls. Cloth could be placed around windows. Families used the rooms that held heat best and accepted that other spaces belonged mostly to winter. Fuel availability could also differ from wooded regions. Some plains households had limited access to timber and relied on coal, purchased wood, crop residues, or other locally available materials. Earlier settlers in some areas famously adapted to scarce timber in ways that later farm households did not necessarily continue. But the deeper point remained: the fuel system depended on the landscape. Where trees were abundant, winter heat could begin with an axe. Where trees were scarce, it might begin with cash, transport, or whatever the fields left behind. The mattress, quilt, and stove looked domestic. Their real supply line stretched across the local environment. Many farmhouses there were older, and older did not automatically mean warmer. Thick construction could help in some cases, while worn windows, altered chimneys, large rooms, and accumulated repairs created problems in others. Houses built over generations often contained additions, passageways, and rooms that behaved differently in cold weather. A family might use only part of a larger house in winter. The kitchen, keeping room, or main heated room became the centre. Bedrooms farther away cooled sharply. Feather beds, wool blankets, bed curtains in some homes, and heavy quilts helped preserve body heat. But wealth and household history shaped what was available. An old house could contain excellent furniture and terrible drafts at the same time. That combination feels contradictory only if we assume age creates one uniform condition. A carefully maintained room could be relatively protected. Another room in the same structure could allow cold air through every edge of the window frame. Families learned the house one doorway at a time. In Appalachia, practices varied sharply across valleys, elevations, decades, and household means. Wood heat became important in many rural households because nearby forests could provide fuel, though access, ownership, and labour still mattered. Cabins and frame houses varied enormously. Some were compact and easier to warm in one area, others were lightly built, poorly sealed, or limited by poverty. Quilting traditions in the region later became celebrated for artistry, but the objects also carried practical weight. A quilt had to cover a real bed in a real room. It was repaired because replacing it required money or materials. It might be made from cloth that had already lived another life as clothing. The beauty did not cancel the cold, nor did resourcefulness remove the social conditions that made reuse necessary. A household with skilled makers could create remarkable bedding, yet the same household might still lack a tight roof, a second stove, enough purchased fuel, or the power to improve rented land. Regional craft can become sentimental when separated from the pressure that produced it. The rural South brings another common mistake. Though conditions differed widely within the region, because average winters were milder than those farther north, it is easy to imagine that cold bedrooms were a minor inconvenience. But a milder climate did not guarantee a warm house. Buildings designed for ventilation during long hot seasons could perform poorly during a sudden freeze. Thin walls, raised floors, gaps, and limited heating made cold spells physically serious. The problem was often not months of continuous deep cold. It was exposure combined with a house that had few defences when cold arrived. A family might own fewer heavy blankets because severe weather was less frequent. Fuel stores might be smaller. A sudden cold wave could push a household into arrangements used only occasionally. Crowding near the fireplace, moving sleeping places, adding every available covering, and keeping vulnerable family members closer to heat. Poverty and tenancy made these moments more dangerous. A black sharecropping family in a poorly maintained cabin could face a cold snap with limited fuel, thin bedding, and little control over repairs. Their experience should not be folded into a cheerful story about southern families gathering cosily around the hearth. The hearth could be warm, the rest of the structure might not be. This contrast appears across all regions. The same object changes meaning depending on the house around it. A quilt in a tight room supplements the heating system. The same quilt in a drafty room becomes the heating system's last line of defense. A shared bed in a prosperous household may be a childhood habit. In a poorer household, it may be the only practical way to keep several children warm. A wood stove on a farm with ample timber represents labour. On a farm without fuel access, it also represents money and dependency. Architecture, ownership, race, class, local materials, transportation, and household labour determined how the weather reached the body. This is why one universal picture of the pre-electric farmhouse fails so quickly. There was no single bedroom, no standard mattress, no national number of quilts, and no shared temperature at which everyone slept. There were patterns, but every pattern changed when it crossed a property line, a mountain range, a racial boundary, or a different kind of farm economy. The listener can still recognise the common movement. Evening warmth gathers in one room. The family prepares the bed before the house cools. Bodies create a smaller climate beneath cloth. The fire weakens. Then the region decides how hard the remaining hours become. In Minnesota, the cold may hold for days. On the plains, wind finds the wall. In New England, an old window tests every repair. In Appalachia, the woodpile and the hillside remain linked. In the rural South, a sudden freeze enters a house built with summer in mind. Different winters press against different walls. Under the quilts, however, every family waits for the same change in darkness. The point when night begins turning toward morning, even though the cold has not yet reached its deepest end. The coldest end of the night is rarely the quietest. A farmhouse after midnight may appear still from the road. No lamp shows at the window. Smoke rises weakly from the chimney, if it rises at all. Inside, sleep is more complicated. The house creaks as boards contract. Wind touches one wall, then another. A loose shutter answers. Somewhere below, the stove gives a small metallic click as its surface cools. A horse shifts in the barn. A cow knocks against a stall. None of these sounds is necessarily alarming, but each belongs to a household trained to notice when an ordinary noise becomes the beginning of a problem. People did not sleep through winter as one unbroken block of unconsciousness. They woke, listened, adjusted, checked, settled, and tried again. A child turns beneath the quilt and pulls part of it away from a sibling. Cold air enters along the edge. The second child wakes just enough to recover the covering, pushes one icy foot toward the centre, and falls asleep again. In the larger bed, an infant stirs. The first sound may be small, but the adult beside the cradle knows the sequence. A restless movement becomes a cry. A hand leaves the warmth of the covers. The quilt lifts. One foot finds the floor. The entire body immediately receives information it did not request. Night care was not an abstract expression of family affection. It was movement through cold air while everyone else remained beneath fabric. The child had to be lifted, fed, soothed, changed, or simply held until breathing became regular again. The adult doing this work lost the warm pocket built over several hours and had to recreate it upon returning. In many households, this responsibility fell heavily on mothers, older daughters, grandmothers, or other women. Nighttime warmth depended partly on someone being willing, or expected, to surrender it. A baby does not care that the stove is low. Illness creates the same refusal to respect household timing. A coughing child may need water. A fever requires watching. An elderly relative may need help rising. Someone with an injured hand, strained back, or winter infection cannot simply be placed beneath 3 quilts and considered repaired. The warmest room may become a sick room. A bed could be moved closer to the stove. Family members might sleep in shifts, or remain partly awake, listening for changes. Fuel use increased because keeping one vulnerable person warm could matter more than saving a log for later. This was care, but it was also calculation. How much wood remained? Would the fire last? Was the room warm enough? Could the person drink? Should someone wake the rest of the household? No monitor answered these questions. A hand touched a forehead. An ear listened to breathing. A lamp was lit and trimmed low. Judgment rested on experience, worry, and whatever medical understanding the family possessed. The room then had to return to darkness. A kerosene lamp or candle provided only limited light and carried its own risk. It was not left burning casually beside dry bedding. Once the immediate task ended, the flame was extinguished and the person crossed the room by memory. Furniture became geography, learned through bruises. The chamber pot saved a longer journey. In a cold farmhouse, leaving the bedroom to reach an outdoor privy at midnight was not an attractive proposition. A chamber pot beneath the bed or nearby allowed the household to avoid crossing dark rooms, descending stairs, finding footwear, opening an outside door, and meeting winter in its full professional capacity. The convenience came with morning work. Someone had to empty and clean it. The object belongs to the history of sleep because it reduced nighttime exposure, but it also transferred discomfort from one moment and person to another. Farmhouse comfort was often built this way. A task disappeared from one person's night because it reappeared in someone else's morning. Even without illness or children, the body itself interrupted sleep. Heavy quilts trapped warmth, but they also made movement slower. A sleeper woke with a numb arm, a cramped leg, or damp clothing after sweating beneath too many layers. Pull the covers down and the body cooled. Leave them in place and the bedding became uncomfortable. Finding the right amount of insulation was less like selecting a thermostat and more like negotiating with several blankets that had formed a committee. Moisture mattered. Breath, perspiration, damp nightclothes, and poorly dried bedding could make the enclosed space clammy. A room that was cold and badly ventilated presented another trade-off. Closing every opening reduced drafts, but smoke, stale air, and moisture still needed somewhere to go. Families did not use one universal rule. They adjusted according to house, stove, weather, health, and habit. The wind could wake everyone without entering the room. It pushed snow against doors, rattled windows, and changed the draft in a chimney. A sudden gust might send smoke back toward the stove room. Someone smelled it, listened, and decided whether the problem required getting up. That decision carried its own tension. Remain beneath the quilt, and perhaps the sound passes. leave the bed, and warmth is certainly lost. A farm trains people to distinguish between inconvenience and urgency, although the lesson is usually taught at unpleasant hours. Animals added another layer. For the households followed here, livestock normally remained in barns, sheds, pens, or other working structures, rather than sleeping beside the family. Exceptions existed, but they should not become the default picture of an American farmhouse. Distance did not make the animals irrelevant during the night. A distressed animal could signal birth, illness, a broken enclosure, a predator, or severe weather entering the building. A farmer might wake because a familiar pattern of sound had changed. The barn that seemed quiet from the bedroom could become the reason boots were pulled onto cold feet at 2 in the morning. Not every noise required action. That was the skill. A horse moving once was ordinary. Repeated striking might not be. Wind against a door was expected. A latch banging open was different. Families learned the soundscape of their own property so thoroughly that a missing sound could be as noticeable as a loud one. The night also carried worry without noise. Weather threatened crops, animals, roofs, roads, and fuel. Debt remained present after the lamp went out. A tenant family could wonder whether the harvest would cover what was owed. A parent might calculate the remaining flour, coal, or medicine while lying perfectly still beneath a quilt. Sleep history is partly the history of thoughts that left no record. Diaries sometimes preserve storms or illness. Account books preserve purchases. Census schedules preserve people and property. They rarely record the 15 minutes spent awake because a child was coughing, or the hour one adult listened to wind against a weak section of roof. Those missing minutes shaped the night anyway. Our household now lies in the hours before dawn. The infant has settled. The children have recovered the quilt. The wind has not opened the barn door. No one has smelled smoke. By ordinary standards, this is a successful night. It has also included waking, listening, lifting, checking, adjusting, and giving up warmth in small amounts. The bed has not been an escape from household labour. It has been the place from which labour is repeatedly summoned. Soon the darkest part of the night will begin to thin. The room will remain cold. The stove may hold only a faint ember, and every sleeper will understand the same unpleasant truth. Staying beneath the covers is easy. The real test begins when someone has to leave them. The first movement is almost always delayed. Someone is awake. The room is still dark, though the blackness near the window has begun to soften. Beneath the quilts, the body is warm enough to pretend that morning has not arrived. Then a sound confirms it. Perhaps a rooster begins early. Perhaps a cow shifts in the barn. Perhaps no sound is needed, because the person responsible for the fire has woken at this hour so many times that the body now remembers before the mind does. One hand leaves the covers. Cold finds it immediately. The person reaches for clothing placed beside the bed. A shirt, stockings, trousers, skirt or underlayers have spent the night at room temperature, which means they now possess all the warmth of the floorboards. Pulling them on beneath the quilt is possible, but awkward. Dressing outside the bed is faster, but it requires surrender. The covers lift. The warm pocket breaks. Feet search for stockings, slippers or shoes before touching the floor. If footwear has been left nearby, the first problem is smaller. If it waits downstairs near the stove, the person must cross part of the house with less protection. The floor is not merely cold, it removes warmth. Wooden boards conduct heat away from bare skin quickly enough to make the body move with sudden purpose. A rug helps where one exists. Neither changes the room's instruction. Do not stand still. Clothing goes on in layers, sometimes without full accuracy. Buttons can be corrected later. A stocking may twist. Morning dignity is postponed until the stove cooperates. The other sleepers remain beneath the quilts. This is the first inequality of dawn. One person gives up the heat that everyone else is still using. In many households, the first riser might be responsible for breakfast, the stove, livestock, or all three. Gender and age shaped the task, but the pattern varied. A farm woman might revive the kitchen fire and begin food preparation. A man or older child might head toward the barn. In smaller households, the same person could manage both domestic heat and animal care before everyone else moved, no matter who rises first. The route begins in cold air. The bedroom door opens. The hallway feels colder than the bed. The stairs creak beneath careful feet. A lamp may be carried, though fuel is saved where possible, and the route is familiar enough to travel in darkness. At the bottom, the kitchen is no longer the generous room of evening. The stove stands black or faintly warm. A hand approaches the iron surface without touching it at first. The person feels for heat. Then the stove door opens. Inside, the fire has become evidence. Ash covers the grate. A few dark pieces remain. Somewhere beneath them, perhaps, a red point survives. Finding it is a small act of archaeology. The poker moves Ash aside. A faint glow appears, then disappears beneath grey powder. Another movement exposes it. The ember is alive, but not yet useful. Kindling waits nearby if the household prepared well. Thin dry wood, shavings, splinters, or another quick-catching material is arranged where the remaining heat can reach it. The draft is opened, air moves through the stove. Then everyone waits for a sign. A thread of smoke, a dark edge becoming orange, one tiny flame. This moment determines whether the morning fire will be revived or rebuilt from nothing. A live coal saves time and frustration. A dead stove demands a new start. And a new start before sunrise can make an otherwise competent adult feel personally betrayed by wood. The kindling catches. Small pieces are added first. Put a large log on too soon, and the weak flame may disappear beneath it. Feed the fire gradually, and the stove begins to draw. The sound changes. Flame strengthens. Iron starts warming from the inside. The room, however, remains cold. Heat has begun, but it has not yet arrived. The first riser now performs several tasks within the narrow circle around the stove. More fuel is brought from the box. Ash may need removal. A kettle is filled if water has not frozen or become painfully cold. Clothing can be hung nearby. Boots may be turned so their interiors face the returning warmth. This is the hour when objects are restored to usefulness. Water becomes pourable rather than shocking. A shirt becomes wearable rather than hostile. A kitchen becomes a room rather than a storage place with a stove in it. The transformation takes time. Meanwhile, the farm is waiting. Livestock cannot remain postponed because the kitchen is still cold. Cows need milking. Animals need feed and water. Ice may have formed in buckets or troughs. A barn door may be drifted with snow or stiff with frost. A sick animal may need checking before breakfast. The person heading outside adds another layer. Coat, cap, gloves, boots, perhaps a scarf pulled across the lower face. The door opens, and the house suddenly understands that it was warm after all. Cold air enters behind the body. The person steps into darkness that is wider and sharper than the bedroom. Snow reflects a little dawn. Breath becomes visible. The path to the barn is known by memory, though wind may have softened its edges. The farmhouse door closes again. Inside, the revived stove works slowly. The person remaining near it, if there is one, begins the next layer of morning labour. Breakfast does not appear because the fire exists. Water must heat. Coffee or another hot drink requires time and ingredients. Food must be prepared around the stove's changing temperature. A cook stove was not controlled by turning a dial. The fire had hotter and cooler areas. Drafts changed. Fuel settled. Pans were moved according to experience. Morning food depended on knowing the stove as a working surface rather than merely a source of warmth. Upstairs, the sleepers begin noticing the change. A faint current of warmer air reaches the stairwell. The smell of smoke, coffee, food, or heating iron moves through the house. Someone hears the stove door close. Another hears boots near the entry. These signals make rising slightly less cruel. Children delay anyway. One lies perfectly still, hoping stillness may be mistaken for sleep. Another places clothing beneath the quilt for a few minutes, using body heat to make it less punishing. A parent calls from downstairs. The reply is vague enough to mean both "I am awake" and "I have no intention of moving." Eventually, the bed opens again. The second person to rise receives a room that is still cold but no longer abandoned. The third may find a warmer kitchen. By the time the youngest child arrives downstairs, the stove is glowing, the kettle is active, and the worst work has already become invisible. This is how household comfort often appears. The result is shared. The sacrifice is earlier. The first riser kneels beside ash while others sleep. The person in the barn breaks ice while breakfast warms. The adult at the stove heats water that will make everyone else's washing, dressing, and eating easier. Morning warmth is manufactured in stages. It begins with one body leaving the quilt. Our family's bedroom is emptying now. The trundle remains pulled out. Blankets lie folded back where children escaped them. The wrapped brick at the foot of the bed has gone completely cold. Below, the kitchen has returned to life. Above, the abandoned beds begin surrendering their stored heat to the room. By noon, they may be aired, shaken, or remade. By evening, the entire system will have to be constructed again. By evening, the beds will be remade, the stove will be fed, and the same cold rooms will begin collecting another set of memories. People remember winter vividly, but they do not always remember it evenly. A childhood bedroom may survive in memory as a place of laughter, shared quilts, whispering siblings, and the relief of finally finding a warm patch beneath the covers. The cold becomes part of the story's charm because the teller already knows that everyone lived long enough to tell it. Hardship changes shape after it ends. A person describing a farmhouse winter 50 years later may remember frost on the window more clearly than the argument over fuel. They may remember the weight of quilts, but not who washed them. They may laugh about racing toward the stove in the morning, while forgetting that someone else had risen earlier to make that race worth winning. This does not make the memory false. It makes it human. Memory keeps sensation exceptionally well. The bite of a floorboard, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of a stove lid being lifted, and the sudden warmth of a shared bed can remain long after dates. Room dimensions and exact routines have blurred. Those sensory details are valuable because official records rarely tell us what a cold sheet felt like against a child's leg. Repeated family stories become smoother. One person's experience stands in for everyone's. A practice used during one severe winter becomes something the family always did. An object used occasionally becomes part of the permanent household ritual. The phrase "we used to" can cover a decade, a single season, or one memorable night. That is why the surviving stories need companionship from objects, photographs, household accounts, government records, building evidence, and other voices. A quilt can show materials, stitches, repairs, wear, and repeated use. It may reveal that several fabrics had earlier lives as dresses, shirts, sacks, or household cloth. A faded section can indicate sunlight or handling. A patched corner shows that the covering remained valuable after its first layer began to fail. The quilt cannot tell us exactly who felt cold beneath it. It cannot explain whether the maker enjoyed the work, resented it, learned it from a mother, performed it for wages, or stayed awake repairing it after everyone else had gone to bed. Archaeology and material history give us the object. Motive and emotion remain harder to recover. The same problem appears with the stove. A preserved iron stove is solid, measurable, and easy to display. Visitors can see the firebox, dampers, cooking surface, and decorative metalwork. A guide can explain how wood or coal entered and how heat moved through the room. The stove does not preserve the hour before dawn. It does not retain the sore hand carrying ash, the child sent to refill the wood box, or the worry caused by a fuel pile shrinking too early. Its iron surface survives more easily than the labour organised around it. Historic houses create another kind of memory. Walking into a restored farmhouse bedroom can be powerful. The bed is made, the quilt lies neatly across it, a chamber pot waits discreetly beneath the frame, a cradle stands nearby, the window looks small, and the stove downstairs suddenly seems very far away. The room helps the modern viewer understand scale. It can also become too perfect. Fresh paint, repaired floors, clean bedding, controlled visitor temperatures, and careful lighting remove many of the conditions that shaped ordinary use. No damp clothing hangs near the heat. No child has pulled the blanket sideways. No ash dust settles on the furniture. No one has just come in from a barn carrying snow and animal smell. The restored room shows an arrangement, not a complete night. It may also show the home of a family whose property survived because the occupants became famous, prosperous, locally important, or fortunate enough to have descendants who preserved the building. The tenant house down the road may have disappeared without photographs or measured drawings. Preservation has a social class. Buildings with durable materials and documented owners are easier to save. The homes of poor tenants, hired workers, black sharecroppers, migrant labourers, and families who moved frequently were less likely to enter museums intact. Their winter nights survive unevenly, often in oral histories, photographs taken by outsiders, census categories, government reports, or the memories of children recorded much later. Sometimes they survive as absence. A record lists the farm's acreage, crop value, animals, machinery, and debt, but says almost nothing about the room where the family slept. The household appears as labour and production before it appears as bodies needing warmth. That silence can mislead us. When an archive preserves 10 detailed accounts from comfortable farm owners and 1 fragment from a tenant household, the imbalance does not prove that comfortable owners represented rural life more accurately. It proves that some people had more opportunities to leave records. Even the language of old accounts needs care. A writer might describe a room as cold without giving a temperature. Another might call a night comfortable because it was better than the previous winter, not because it resembled modern comfort. A visitor from a city could be shocked by conditions that the household considered ordinary. A family member might minimize hardship because endurance had become part of personal identity. The word comfortable moves with the person using it. Photographs create their own quiet distortions. Long exposure times and formal poses encourage stillness. Bedding is arranged. Clothing is chosen. Rooms are presented rather than caught in the middle of work. A photograph may show 3 children on a bed, but not prove that all 3 slept there every night. A quilt draped over the footboard may be decorative, practical, or temporarily placed for the camera. The image is evidence, but not a confession. Family pride can soften the edges further. Stories about surviving cold often become evidence of toughness. Grandparents recall waking to ice at the window. Parents describe carrying wood through snow. Children hear that earlier generations never complained. They almost certainly complained. Complaining is one of the most renewable forms of household heat. The serious point is that people adapted because they had to. Turning that adaptation into proof that cold did not trouble them removes the physical reality from the story. Endurance is not the absence of discomfort. It is continued action despite discomfort. Nostalgia is strongest around shared warmth. A crowded kitchen can be remembered as togetherness. A shared bed can become sibling closeness. The stove becomes the centre of family life. These things may all be true. They may also exist beside exhaustion, lack of privacy, smoke, uneven workloads, and the inability to afford another room or more fuel. History does not require choosing one version. The same kitchen can be loving and overcrowded. The same quilt can be beautiful and necessary. The same shared bed can feel safe to one child and unbearable to another. Our imagined farmhouse has now passed through another day. The beds are aired and remade. Ash has been carried out, Fresh wood rests beside the stove. Night approaches again. If this house survives into the future, a visitor may stand in the bedroom and admire the quilt. They may be told how the family kept warm after the fire died. What they may not see is the person who shook the mattress, repaired the seam, carried the log, settled the baby, emptied the chamber pot, and rose first in the dark. The stove can remain in a museum for another century. The hands that emptied its ash are much harder to recover. And memory, like a quilt, preserves warmth best while hiding how many separate pieces were required to make it. A quilt can preserve the memory of an old winter, but a wire changes what the next winter is allowed to become. For many rural families, electricity did not arrive as an overnight transformation. It came as poles along a road, meetings in a schoolhouse, papers signed by neighbours, loans arranged through a cooperative, and crews stretching lines across fields. A wire reached the farm. A meter appeared on the wall. A switch was installed. Someone turned it, and light filled a room without a match, a wick, a smoky chimney, or the careful trimming of a lamp. Children could read longer, sewing could continue with steadier light. Tools, clothing, and bedding could be inspected more easily. The first riser no longer had to find the stove, lamp, and matches in darkness. A barn could receive electric light, making early chores safer and less dependent on lanterns. The farmhouse did not become warm because a bulb glowed. Electric service expanded the household's choices, but most early rural lines were not designed to replace every wood stove, coal stove, or furnace immediately. Electric resistance heat consumes substantial power and required wiring, equipment, and costs that many farm households could not easily support. The old stove often remained in the kitchen, doing heavy work it had done before the poles arrived. So the first electric winter could look strangely familiar. The wood box still needed filling. Ash still had to be carried out. The upstairs bedroom could still become cold. A child might go to bed beneath the same quilts while an electric bulb shone from the ceiling. Rural electrification accelerated during the 1930s after federal programs supported the extension of service into areas private utilities had often considered too expensive to serve. The Rural Electrification Act became law in 1936. At that point, only a small share of American farms had electric service. By the early 1950s, more than 90% did. One farm received service while another several miles away waited. A family near an existing line had different prospects from one beyond a river, mountain road, or sparsely settled countryside. Local organisation mattered, so did debt, geography, and the ability of neighbours to cooperate around a shared system. Electricity did not simply arrive from the future. People had to organise it into the landscape. A cooperative meeting could determine whether a bedroom would one day contain an outlet. Engineers surveyed routes. Farmers granted rights of way. Poles were raised and connected. Households paid membership fees or wiring costs. Old buildings had to be adapted carefully because dry wood, improvised wiring, and overloaded circuits were not a relaxing combination. The first changes often concerned light, water, and labour. An electric pump could reduce the work of drawing or carrying water. Motors could assist with milking, grinding, cooling, or other farm tasks. Radios connected isolated households to weather reports, news, music, and voices beyond the road. Refrigeration, where affordable, changed food storage. Washing machines reduced some forms of domestic labour, though they created new expectations about how often clothing and bedding should be washed. Every labour-saving device arrived with a quiet question: whose labour was being saved? A pump could spare repeated hauling. A washing machine could reduce scrubbing. But someone still sorted garments, supplied water, fed them through the machine, rinsed, wrung, carried, hung, and folded. An electric iron removed the need to heat several heavy irons on a stove, yet ironing did not perform itself out of gratitude. Electricity shifted work before it eliminated it. In the bedroom, the changes appeared gradually. A ceiling light made nighttime care easier. A parent could check a sick child without carrying an open flame beside bedding. Clothing could be found without feeling along a chair in darkness. A bedside lamp, where wiring and money allowed, reduced the distance between waking and seeing. Electric blankets and heated mattress pads would eventually offer warmth around the body, but they should not be projected too early or treated as immediate rural necessities. They required purchase, dependable service, suitable wiring, and household trust in an electrical device operating inside a bed. For many families, the quilt remained more familiar than the heating element. Other technologies changed household warmth indirectly. Electric motors could power fans or furnace equipment in homes designed for them. Improved pumps and plumbing could make washing and bathing easier. Better lighting allowed repairs, sewing, and fuel management to continue with greater precision. Yet the building itself still mattered. Electricity did not seal a window. It did not insulate a roof. It did not close the gap beneath a door or repair a landlord's wall. A tenant family connected to a line could still sleep in poor housing. A prosperous owner could add appliances and improve the structure. The new service therefore entered the same older inequalities of property, race, class, and access. One household used electricity to power several machines. Another used one bulb carefully because every additional appliance cost money. A black farm family in the rural south might face discriminatory credit, lower incomes, and housing controlled by a landlord even after electrical lines entered the area. A remote mountain household might wait longer for connection. A farm carrying heavy debt could postpone rewiring or appliances. The pole beside the road represented possibility. It did not guarantee equal comfort. Even households that welcomed electricity could regard it with caution. Bills had to be paid, fuses blew, motors failed, storms brought lines down. Older family members who understood every sound of a wood stove now had to trust switches, wires, and equipment whose workings remained hidden inside walls. The stove was dangerous, but its danger was visible. Electricity could seem almost suspiciously clean. There was no flame to watch and no ember to rake. People learned new habits, replacing fuses correctly, keeping cords in good condition, avoiding overloaded outlets, and accepting that a wire should not be repaired with the same confidence used on a fence. The nighttime routine began to separate from the fire. A lamp could remain on while the stove burned low. Someone could descend the stairs without carrying a flame. The kitchen could be lit before the fire revived. A child waking from a bad dream no longer depended entirely on moonlight, memory, or a parent striking a match. This changed the emotional geography of the house. Darkness had once concentrated everyone around a small number of lamps in the stove room. Electric light spread usable space into halls, bedrooms, porches, and barns. The farmhouse could remain active after sunset without every task gathering around one flame. Warmth remained more stubborn. For years, the old and new systems overlapped. Electric wires ran above a woodpile. A radio played beside a coal stove. A washing machine stood in a house whose upstairs bedrooms still froze. A child completed homework beneath an electric bulb, then climbed into a bed still dependent on quilts and heat rising from the old stove. From a distance, this looks like the moment the old world ended and the electric one began. Inside the farmhouse, it was messier than that. One new light, one old stove, one repaired quilt, one unpaid bill, one room still colder than the others. By the time electricity became common across most American farms, the winter bedroom had begun to change. But it had not forgotten its earlier system. Families continued to close doors, layer bedding, share rooms, manage fuel, and place vulnerable sleepers where warmth collected best. The wire did not erase the quilt. It gave the household more ways to protect what lay beneath it. And as the electric bulb glowed over the old bed, the room held two histories at once. The long memory of warmth built by hands, and the beginning of warmth that might someday arrive through the wall. The wall now carries a wire. The ceiling holds a bulb. Somewhere below, the stove still waits for wood. That is how the old winter bedroom changes without disappearing. At the beginning of this night, the room seemed simple. It was cold. The bed was colder. A family climbed the stairs, lifted heavy quilts, and tried to preserve enough body heat to reach morning. Now the same room is crowded with meanings. The window is a boundary between weather and whatever protection the household could afford. Its frame reveals workmanship, age, ownership, and whether anyone had the money or authority to repair it. The stove below is woodland, wages, coal dust, ash, tools, judgment, and time. Its fire begins months before winter, in a tree selected for cutting or a payment made for fuel. It continues in the armload carried through snow and in the hand that opens the iron door before bed. The quilt is saved cloth, purchased batting, worn clothing given another use, hours of sewing, repeated washing, careful drying, mended edges, and the decision that this bed needs another layer more than some other bed does. The person beneath it does not sleep alone, even when the mattress holds only one body. Other people's labour lies there too. A child may feel only the weight of the covering. An adult may feel its cost. A mother may know which seam needs repair. A tenant may know that no number of quilts can fully correct the wall beside the bed. A hired hand may understand that the warmest room belongs to someone else. The bed gathers the household into one small shape. There is the trundle beneath the larger frame, the cradle close enough to reach without crossing the room, clothing stacked nearby so morning can begin before anyone is ready, a wrapped brick cooling near the foot of the mattress, a chamber pot positioned beneath the bed because the outdoor privy is beyond several dark rooms and a winter door. None of these objects defeats the cold. Together, they reduce the number of times the body must face it directly. That is the central skill running through the entire night. Farm families did not usually make winter disappear from the house. They decided where to let it remain. It could stay in the unused parlour. It could wait in the upstairs hallway. It could collect beside the window or beneath the door. The household concentrated fuel, people, cloth, and activity into smaller areas, creating islands of usable warmth inside a building that still belonged partly to the weather. This was practical, but it was not effortless. Every island required a shore. Someone closed the room that would not be heated. Someone carried the wood. Someone chose which child slept near the wall. Someone tucked the quilt, warmed the brick, checked the baby, or listened for smoke. Someone measured the remaining fuel against the weeks before spring. Then someone woke first. That person forms the quiet centre of the story. Before dawn, the bedroom still contains the night's last warmth. The stove downstairs may hold one ember beneath ash. The water is cold. The floor is colder. Clothing waits with no sympathy at all. One body leaves the bed. The quilt lifts. Warm air escapes. Feet touch the boards. A door opens. The staircase receives a figure moving through darkness toward the stove. At first, nothing changes for the people still sleeping. Then a poker moves inside iron. Kindling catches. A thin flame appears. The kettle is filled. Boots are turned toward the returning heat. Someone steps outside toward livestock while another begins breakfast. The kitchen slowly becomes habitable again. By the time the children arrive, the hardest minutes have already passed. This is how comfort often enters history, after the labour that produced it has left the frame. We remember the warm stove, but not always the cold hands that revived it. We preserve the quilt, but lose the hours used to make it. We admire the farmhouse as a complete object, although the people inside experienced it as a series of doors, drafts, chores, and choices. Electricity eventually changes many of those choices. The lamp no longer needs trimming. The hallway can be lit with a switch. A pump may move water. A motor may reduce labour in the barn. Later technologies offer new ways to warm rooms, beds, and entire houses. But the arrival of a wire does not divide history cleanly into darkness and comfort. The first electric bulb may shine above the same trundle bed. The family may still carry wood. The upstairs room may still be cold. The old quilt remains because electricity has not made fabric obsolete. and because households do not discard a working survival system simply because a new one has appeared at the edge of it. For years, the bedroom contains both worlds: a bulb over the bed, a stove below, a woodpile outside, quilts over sleeping children. The arrangement changes gradually until a later generation begins to assume that bedrooms should remain warm all night, that clothing should not freeze against the room, and that touching the floor before dawn should not require an act of character. That expectation is itself historical. Modern comfort can make earlier households seem strange, or even careless, for allowing bedrooms to become so cold. But the people inside those rooms were working within the technologies, resources, buildings, and social arrangements available to them. They understood insulation through practice. They understood heat loss through the body. They understood that a large fire could waste fuel, that damp bedding betrayed the sleeper, that shared space preserved warmth, and that the first minutes after leaving the bed were often the most difficult part of the night. They were not immune to cold. They were organised around it. That difference matters. Romantic stories sometimes turn winter hardship into proof that earlier generations were naturally stronger. They describe frost on the window, children under several quilts, and a morning fire revived from embers, then leave the impression that people simply accepted the discomfort with cheerful discipline. Some did remember it fondly. Some almost certainly hated every frozen morning. Most probably felt different things on different days. The same child could enjoy whispering beneath a shared quilt and resent the siblings stealing it. The same adult could take pride in a well-managed stove and still dread leaving the bed. The same family could remember closeness while also remembering smoke, crowding, illness, and exhaustion. A truthful history has room for all of that. It does not need to make the farmhouse cozy enough for nostalgia or miserable enough for spectacle. It needs only to return us to the room. The electric bulb is switched off. The stove below gives one final settling sound. Outside, frost gathers along the window. Inside, the air cools, but more slowly beneath the covers. The trundle is occupied, the cradle is close. Clothing waits on the chair. A patched quilt rises and falls with the breathing beneath it. For a few hours, the household has reduced winter to the thin distance between skin and cloth. Then the darkness begins to pale. One sleeper wakes before the others. A hand moves toward the edge of the quilt and pauses there, still inside the warmth built during the night. Beyond that edge are cold floorboards, ash, kindling, water, animals, breakfast, and the beginning of another day. The hand lifts the quilt. Winter enters for one brief second. Then a pair of feet touches the floor, and the house begins making warmth again.